Yeah,
yes.
Like you got someone so indignant that they
She
were
did her own
inspired to make.
comic. Yes.
That's incredible. Okay, welcome back everyone to the Comics Cube. Today I sit down with a true pioneer in the field of comics, Eisner Hall of Famer, Miss Trina Robbins. Hello, Miss Robbins. Welcome to the Comics Cube.
Thank you.
I was trying to figure out how I wanted this interview to go, and I thought I was overcomplicating it, so I thought I'd better start at the beginning, actually. You got your start by being active in the science fiction fandom. Now, a lot of people kind of think that fans turning pro is a new phenomenon, but it's really not, is it? Like, what was a creative freedom? What was creative energy like back
Well, we have to remember that when I did my earliest art for mimeographed fanzines, I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was just a teenage science fiction fan. Fandom does, though, come originally, the whole concept of fandom does come from science fiction. Science fiction fans putting on conventions, putting together zines, fanzines. That's where the term zine comes from. But it's really, that part, really, we're just talking about a teenage fan. It has nothing to do with what I did later. I think my comics career started in 1966 when I was, the first thing I did was published in the East Village Other, excuse me, which was a New York underground newspaper.
Mm-hmm. Did you have trouble getting in because, you know, it was the 60s and no trouble?
No,
okay.
Not at all, not at all. Excuse me. The first thing I did, really, I didn't even intend for it to get published. It was a little drawing, it was kind of a proto-comic, little drawing with a huge speech balloon. Everything was in the speech balloon. And I went to the East Village Other offices and nobody was home, so I just stuck it under the door.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, lo and behold, they published it. And, you know, for the next 2 or 3 years, I was a regular, you know, doing comics for the East Village Other.
That's interesting. Like so you just kind of just stuck it under the door. It's not.
Yes, I did. I slid it under the door.
That's pretty cool. A few years later, in 1970, you produced "It Ain't Me, Babe" comics.
Yes, yes.
That's got a really iconic cover. It's got all of these other, it's got all of these established female characters just kind of running in a like they were rallying. Was it?
Yes.
How did it feel?
That's a good descriptive term. They were rallying, running with their fists up. I really think, I mean, I'm very proud of that book. I mean, it was literally the very, very first all-woman comic book ever. You know, unless they've been producing them on Mars. It was the first ever.
I saw that some people describe it as one of the first ever, and it's not.
Oh,
it's the first ever.
No, thank you. That makes me so mad. It's like they're hedging their bets. It's like they're saying, oh, maybe there was another one somewhere. Well, no, there wasn't. No, there wasn't. This is the very first all-woman comic book, and I'm very proud of it.
And did it feel, I'm sure it felt empowering taking, you know, aside from just doing all those things, but that one cover, taking all of those characters and putting them in a rallying position. And also, you did this because it was difficult for, like, can you describe how difficult it was for women to get into the scene back then? Well,
I wouldn't say difficult, I would say impossible.
Oh, that's worse. Okay.
In New York, when I was drawing for the East Village Other, by the way, the nickname for it was Evo, EVO. So I'm going to call it from now on Evo because that's how I think of it. When I was drawing for Evo, it didn't matter if you were male or female. I was just completely accepted. But what I was not accepted by, once I got to San Francisco in 1970, I was not accepted by the clique of male underground cartoonists. And it was all guys. There was only one other woman drawing comics like me in San Francisco. And that was Barbara Mendez, who went by the nickname Willie. So
Really, yeah.
I will call her Willie from now on. And the guys simply, they didn't allow me into their circle. So it was 1970 really in San Francisco that things changed for me, that suddenly I was an outcast. I was not invited into their circle. I was not invited into their books or their parties, which they had a lot of. And so I had joined the staff of It Ain't Me Babe, which was, here's another first. It Ain't Me Babe was America's first feminist newspaper, the very first.
Really?
And I joined their staff. Yes, the very first. When I joined the staff, I thought they were the first in California, but they were the first in the whole country, it turns out. So there's another first. I joined the staff. I drew covers for them and back covers and little spot illustrations. And after I'd worked with them for a few months, it was because I was working with these people and I had them, I wasn't alone anymore. So I felt strong enough that I could say, hey, why can't I do a comic too? Why can't I put out a comic book? And I just, Willie Mendez did a large part of it. She was a major contributor. I was the other major contributor. And then I found other women who drew, but had not done comics. But I knew they were good. And I said, would you like to draw a comic for this? And they all went, oh, a comic, yeah, that's fun. That's a good idea. And that's how the book came together.
For the benefit of I'm 37 years old. So for the benefit of any viewers who are younger than me, would you say that it's improved since? Because one of the things that really kind of gets to me when it comes to this kind of stuff is kind of the younger generation not understanding how far we've come.
Yes. God has it improved. It's incredible now. I mean, for the longest time, if you wanted to draw comics, you really had two choices. One was mainstream, and mainstream, the big two, Marvel and DC, was all about guys punching other guys. That's basically what it was about. And this isn't something that women, and an awful lot of men too, this isn't something we want to draw. This isn't even something we can draw. I'm not very good at guys punching each other. That's not what I do. But the other alternative was the underground. But the underground was completely male dominated, 98% male. And it was all about sex and drugs and rock and roll. And, the sex part was extremely misogynist towards women. It was all male gaze and male viewpoint. So there was, until It Ain't Me Babe, there was nothing really for women. So suddenly we had another kind of comic with another kind of contributors.
You, from It Ain't Me Babe, you launched Women's Comics in 1972.
I and 9 other women launched Women's Comics. This was not a solo performance.
So you and 9 other women launched Women's Comics.
Yes.
So that's WIMM. I don't know if I should say I or E.
Yes.
Because I've seen
later it became I. Later it was Women's Comics, because this was a kind of a feminist thing. You weren't supposed to use the word men. And people were telling us, you're spelling women wrong. But they didn't mean the WIMM, they meant the men, MEN. So for the last issue, we changed it to Women's Comics.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. It was very, aside from being feminist, it was also very entrepreneurial, because you basically started a comic from scratch, and then you discovered a lot of new talent in those 20 years, like Melinda Gebbie and Carol Leigh.
Yes, it was amazing. It was amazing how many women did their first comics in Women's Comics and then went on to fame, if not fortune.
They're really great too, because I follow Carol Leigh every day on Go Comics.
She's wonderful, isn't she?
Great.
Yes.
She's great. And Melinda Gebbie is also the
yes.
names that I mentioned.
Oh, Melinda is amazing. I really I long to see new work by her. I mean, I don't know what she's doing there in England, you know.
Yeah. I think the last thing I saw of hers was,
Was the girls the what was it called?
I think it was Lost Girls.
Lost
It
Girls.
might have
Yeah,
that might have been it.
that was a masterpiece.
Um, but the thing about women's comics is that not everyone was on the same boat. Like you had some conflicts within the group, and some people left, and spun off into some splinter groups. What is the learning experience there, and what do you think?
Um,
Yeah, what do you think modern entrepreneurs and activists can learn from that
well, I
experience?
think that, by the way, some people did spin off into splinter groups, but they didn't really leave women's comics. I mean, the women who have criticized women's are actually published in women's until the end. So they never left the book. They just formed their own splinter group. So that's, people will always disagree. People will always disagree. I think that the women who formed their own splinter groups felt that I was this hardcore, you know, feminazi bitch dyke or something, which I wasn't. I'm a feminist, but I was never such a feminist that, I had always had my sense of humor, but they didn't somehow see that.
You in the first ever women's comics, you wrote Sandy Comes Out, which is a story
Yes.
about a friend of yours, and it's as far as we can tell, and I'm not trying to hedge my bets, it's the first time ever that that tells the story of a gay woman with and not have it be pornographic.
Yes, it's another first. I'm very proud of that one. I'm extremely proud of Sandy Comes Out. And I did it with Sandy kind of overseeing it. Sandy approved of everything I did in the book, in the comic. And I gave her the originals after I had done it, after it had been published. And there's a whole story. Sandy eventually moved to Seattle, and I lost touch with her because she had changed her last name. This was another early feminist thing. You didn't want to have your original name was always, of course, your father's name, and we called them slave names, which was why my earliest comics, if you look at them from the 70s, are just signed Trina.
I saw, yeah.
No last name. But Sandy changed her last name. Excuse me. She changed her last name, and I didn't know how to find her because I didn't know what her last name was. I heard it was something geographical, and because she lived in Seattle, I figured, oh, she's become Sandy Seattle. But she wasn't. She had become Sandy Colorado for some reason, having nothing to do with Seattle at all. So I never found her. I couldn't find her again until one day, this very nice looking and nice young man, I'm on my own block, approaches me and says, "You're Trina Robbins, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I'm Sandy's son." And there he was living like 3 houses down from me on my own block.
Oh my God, that's such a great story.
It was a great story. So we went out for lunch, and it's also a little bit of a sad story because he told me that Sandy had died. She had cancer and she died of cancer. But he had those pages. And I said, well, you should have them because they're about your mother. But can I have full size, really high resolution scans? And I still don't have those scans. He keeps saying he'll send them, but he hasn't because he moved to Los Angeles. But we're still in touch.
I guess finding high resolution scanners are difficult.
I guess.
What advice would you give to anyone who's trying to start their own comic with a group of people? Was it difficult, like logistically speaking, getting people together?
No, not at all. The first group of women who met for women's comics, the 10 of us, were from the Bay Area, which means not just San Francisco, but Berkeley, Oakland, that whole area around San Francisco Bay is called the Bay Area. And that was easy. And once we had the first issue out, and in the first issue, we called for submissions. We said, send us work. We were deluged. We were deluged by submissions, art by various women who had seen the comic and said, oh, an old woman comic book. Hey, I can do that. I mean, that's the way it starts. And we would meet once a, we would meet once a month and just sit on the floor surrounded by all these submissions and go through them and decide what we liked and what we didn't like. And it really was a collective. The editor had the final say, but it really was a collective because we all made decisions.
Did you ever get pushback from the male underground cartoonists for your outspokenness?
No, I mean, things got back to me about what they said. I mean, in those early days when it was me and the boys' clique, I heard about some things they said about me. And again, I was regarded by these guys. It was really, when I think back, of course, I'm delighted that I was such a threat to them. But I heard that they made remarks like, here comes Trina, hide the knives, which is ridiculous. They thought I was, like I said, a man-hating feminazi bitch, which I wasn't.
I never got any of that from your work.
Well,
Quite
that's because
honestly.
I wasn't.
Exactly. I don't know what. Okay. And in 1986, you broke another barrier because you were the first woman to draw Wonder Woman. And I want to
Well,
ask you, yeah.
actually, no, I'm not. Ramona Fradon drew Wonder Woman in Super Friends in 1970. So she's the first woman to draw Wonder Woman for publication.
Oh, for publication. But you were the first one to draw her title.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
And how did it feel breaking that barrier, which
At
seems
the time,
46 years overdue?
you know what? When you do firsts, you're not thinking, wow, this is a first. Like when I did Sandy Comes Out, I didn't think, wow, this is the first comic about a lesbian. It was just, I wanted to tell Sandy's story, that's all. So when I did Wonder Woman, I was delighted to do it. But I didn't think in terms of, oh gosh, I'm the first woman to do Wonder Woman. It isn't until later that you look back and you go, oh, what do you know was the first?
Getting back to Sandy, I just wanted to ask, like, now that you're seeing in comics and other pop culture just how accepted homosexuality is, how does that feel knowing that you helped kick that door open?
And actually, I very much helped kick that door open because when women's comics came out with the Sandy story, a young art student named Mary Wings was one of the many women who saw it. And Mary just happened to be gay. And she saw this, and her first thought was, a straight woman, a cisgendered woman did this. That's not right. It should have been done by a lesbian. And of course, I did it, and nobody else had done it. So it wasn't like I took it away from the lesbians, but it inspired her to put out the first lesbian comic book, and that was called Come Out Comics. And Mary did a couple of other comics, and she became a mystery writer. Mary and I are now, of course, she was so indignant. I love that because now, of course, we're very good friends. And in fact, there's a panel that we do together. CCA is a local art college. And for the past 3 years, this one art teacher has had us as guests on a panel of pioneer women cartoonists. And the first LGBT comic convention, which was held in New York, Mary and I were both guests and roommates, in fact, at that convention. So, here's this woman who was absolutely indignant when she saw my comic and went on to produce her own lesbian comic, the first lesbian comic, and now we're great friends.
That's incredible. Even in spite, you even in indignance, you inspired someone.
Oh, that it was her indignance. Yes.
Like you got someone so indignant that they
she
were
did
inspired
her own comic.
That's incredible. Yeah, I've seen that kind of criticism a lot, that these stories should be told by those people, but someone has to tell them first.
Someone has to tell them. Nobody else was telling that story, so I told it. That's the cultural appropriation thing, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, does that mean that I can only draw comics about white women. You know, there's a lot of people I want to do comics about.
Yeah, I'm a Filipino, so like whenever somebody says that only, like, let's say only Chinese people should play Chinese people, I'm like, well, in that case, Filipino actors would just never have a job.
That's right. One of the contributors to the first 2 issues of women's comics is a Filipina. Vida Chan is her name now. God help me, I forget. Etna Jundis was what she called herself in those days.
Okay, that's great.
And in the second women's comics, she did a page on Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii.
Cultural siblings,
Yes.
not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Getting back to Wonder Woman, so this is strange to me because I was growing up in the 90s. So the peak of my actual buying was in the mid 90s to the mid 2000s. And the thing that I noticed about underground cartoonists back then was they hated superheroes.
Yes, I hate superheroes. Yes.
But you love Wonder Woman.
You know, she's not like the other superheroes. She's an Amazon. There's a lot of Greek mythology going on around Wonder Woman. And she's a woman, you know. I mean, in those days, the only women really were the token woman in the super team. There'd be a super team, you know, 3 guys and a girl, you know, and the women really didn't get to do much. They didn't get to do all that the guys did. But in general, I really can't stand their costumes. I hate those garish skin-tight outfits they wear, and I really prefer Wonder Woman's cute little outfit, especially the original one. It's kind of like a majorette outfit or something you'd wear in a parade. And clothes mean a lot to me. I love clothes.
Yeah.
And just, I found the superheroes growing up. I read comics all the time as a kid, and I would buy any comic that had a woman on the cover, as not as somebody tied to a chair and being rescued, but in a dominant position, you know, as the heroine of the story. And the male comics really bored me to tears. I even couldn't stand their short haircuts, and, you know, and then in the, of course, late 60s and 70s, you know, they just were so out of place with that short hair when all the real guys had long hair.
Oh, like, yeah.
And also, finally, there's just the concept. The superhero concept is all about fighting. It's all about, if there's a problem, you use your fists, you know? Violence was the way to solve problems, and still is in superhero comics. You know, you have to fight someone.
Do you think that's one of the things that makes Wonder Woman separate, because she's...
Well, you know, the original Wonder Woman, she didn't really had what they called Amazon training. And, you know, it was such super training that she could do these amazing things, that she could run really fast and leap high. She didn't fly in the beginning. It's really a cop-out nowadays. All superheroes can fly. Well, that's really boring, you know? And no explanation for why they can fly. Now, at least when Wonder Woman started to fly, that was when George Perez was drawing it.
Yeah.
And she could fly because she was wearing Mercury's winged sandals. That gave her the power of flight. But they've done away with that. They've done away with that, and now she can just fly like any other superhero. And that's really, it's a cop-out, and it's lazy, and it's boring.
I found out that the reason they made Superman able to fly was because in the cartoon, jumping was too hard to animate. It's like,
oh, isn't that? Wow, that's really interesting. Sure, because in the beginning, he could leap tall buildings in a single bound. And that was much cooler, really, and made him more human.
Yeah, it's hard to work out the physics when you're animating, I guess.
Yes.
Was the problem. You spoke about George Perez. That was right after your
Yes.
your 4-issue run on Wonder Woman. I thought you were such a good pick for it, because you have a style that is closely, it can closely evoke the style of Harry Peters.
Well, that was on purpose. I mean, I had a huge stack of Golden Age Wonder Woman comics next to me that I used as reference. I wanted to do this in the style of Harry Peter. I mean, he was, he wasn't just the original Wonder Woman artist. He visually, he was her visual creator, just as much as Marston was her verbal creator or her mythic creator. He formed Wonder Woman. And all through history, in literary history, there have been artists who, well, for instance, John Tenniel, who really, Lewis Carroll, of course, created Alice from Alice in Wonderland, but it was Tenniel who visually created her as the girl with the long blonde hair and the little blue dress and the white pinafore and the striped tights. And now all Alices look like that because he created that Alice visually. So the artist is very important.
You worked with Kurt. I don't know how to say his name. Kurt Busiek. Busiek in that on that title, and then later on, you wrote a Wonder Woman story called the Once and Future Story.
Yes, and that's another one I'm really proud of. Colleen Duran drew it, and we spoke a lot, communicated a lot over the phone back in the old days when all you had was phones.
Yeah.
And we were just totally simpatico. It was a pleasure working with her, and she's such a good artist.
What is the main difference between writing a comic for someone else, drawing a comic that somebody else wrote, and having full control, of the writing and the drawing? Which one would you prefer?
Full control is best, but as I say, I really don't draw anymore. So for me, what is best is writing it, but then being in constant contact with the artist as the artist works on it, and getting, because I have, even if I don't draw anymore, I have an artist's vision of what things look like. And I always send a lot of reference, always lots and lots of reference. And, so working closely with the artist is the best thing of all.
I'd like you to educate me on something, and this is me actually asking, because I have such a difficult time articulating this, but you came up with the design for Vampirella in 1969.
Yes. Really not the design for the character, just her costume.
Just her costume, which that actually surprised me because I did not know that until I was preparing for this interview. I thought that was all Ackerman. I thought it was all Forrest Ackerman.
No. First of all, he was a writer, so visually he had no say at all in how she looked. And the costume that I came up with was, even before the first issue had come out, Frank Frazetta was doing the cover, and Jim Warren it wasn't what he had in his head about what the character should be wearing. I think Frazetta had simply put her in a little red bikini, big deal. So I actually came up with the design. Frazetta was, I don't know where he was, in his home in upstate New York, and I was in New York City sitting at Jim Warren's desk while Jim was talking to Frazetta and explaining verbally what he wanted. But of course, Jim was not an artist. So I sketched it out. And handed it to him. And he said, to Frazetta, he said, just a minute, there's a young lady here who knows exactly what I want. And I got on the phone with Frazetta and explained it verbally perfectly so that he understood. Artist to artist, we know how to explain this verbally, explain a picture verbally. And that's what I did.
I think the thing that I would like you to kind of educate me about, because there's a whole, especially in recent years, there's been a whole debate about how women are portrayed in comics. And some people like to point to the costume for that. And I can't really explain it. I can't figure out what makes it so that, I know you're very critical of the way Wonder Woman was drawn in the 90s. And I can't quite explain why that is very different from somebody like Vampirella, which is, I can kind of figure it out in my head, but I can't quite articulate
Well,
the reason?
actually, the original Vampirella that I came up with the original costume with Frank Frazetta was not as brief as what they later, when Jim Warren was no longer publishing it and when they had different artists, especially in the 90s again, that bad girl style, it became just ridiculous. It was like, she was wearing red ribbons. And it's more than that, though. It's not just that they're 3/4 naked. It's the exaggeration. It's ridiculous breasts that no one ever had, even with plastic surgery. It's mostly it's the breasts and the bare asses. Can I say that on
Yeah.
your show? The bare asses, the bare butts that are, that kind of the Brazilian swimsuit look, which, by the way, I've been to Rio de Janeiro twice, and I never saw women wearing swimsuits like that, despite what people say.
Yeah, I did see your design for the original Vampirella. It was a
Yes,
little, it was thicker, like the fabric
yes,
was covered more.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So would you say a lot of it is in the way that artists depict the posing
Oh
as
God,
well?
yes. Kate Beaton, who is a Canadian cartoonist, a brilliant, funny as all hell Canadian cartoonist, came up with the term Brokeback Pose, which means, you see the bust and you see the butts at the same time. And that's physically impossible unless you kind of break the back and twist the character around. So yeah, that was very popular in the 90s with the bad girl comics, the Brokeback Pose. And it's of course ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, that's when I was collecting, and even I couldn't see. It was very ridiculous. There was some.
Mhm.
Uh, it's just not believable at all, and you couldn't really take it seriously.
No, it was a boy's fantasy. I mean, the way they were drawn, they were the fantasies of the artists who never really looked at real women.
What advice would you give to people now in order to portray convincing women, both artistically and in terms of the writing?
Look at women. Look at women. I mean, I am very visual, and I comment on good-looking men and women. I'll be sitting there having coffee with my partner, and I'll go, "Oh my God, isn't she beautiful?" Or "Look at him, doesn't he look fabulous?" Um, just look at people. Look at real people. Real people are very beautiful.
You spend a lot of time of course, pushing women cartoonists to the forefront, and you've written many books about them. I'm proud to say that From Girls to Girls, a
Mm.
history of women's comics, actually helped get me through a particular course in college.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, I was doing an independent study on the history of comics, and that was one of my reference materials. So you've written quite a few, Women in the Comics, Girls to Girls, Pretty in Ink. Why do you think comics history in general still overlooks female cartoonists?
That's why I've written all my histories of women cartoonists for that very reason, because they've been overlooked. And because when you are not written about, you are forgotten. And these women were forgotten. Now they're not. Now everybody, not literally everybody, but people who know their comics know who Nell Brinkley was, know who Tarpe Mills was, know who Lily Renee is. She's still with us, by the way, at 99. Lily Renee is still with us. But nobody knew about them before I wrote about them, because when guys write about comics, they simply overlook the women. They want to write about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Spider-Man and the Hulk, um, because that's what they liked growing up. They all read the Fantastic Four and X-Men and stuff growing up. But so they've ignored the women. I'm not going to mention names here, but an extremely well-regarded cartoonist, I mean, well-regarded and not a superhero cartoonist, said he was giving a talk about cartoonists, the history of comics, and a woman in the audience, because he didn't mention any women, a woman in the audience spoke up, and this woman also, not going to name names, but she happens to be a woman cartoonist. And she asked, but what about the women? Anyway, he said women didn't draw comics in those days. And like I say, I'm not going to mention his name or her name, but it's incredible how little some of these guys knew.
Yeah, I think I've
Or
been to a
cared to
few of
know. That was
those.
the thing. They weren't interested. They didn't care to know.
I think I've been to when I lived in the U.S. because I lived in the U.S. for 5 years. I went to some talks about given by some cartoonists, and I don't think those talks ever mentioned women ever.
No,
I,
no.
that guy might have actually been the same person you're referring to.
Indeed.
Is he a well-regarded non-superhero cartoonist?
He's a very well-regarded non-superhero artist.
But you think it's getting better though?
Oh, so much better. I mean, all I ever really wanted was for women to be accepted. That's all I wanted. But now there are more women drawing comics than ever before, ever. And people know. I hope they know their history, and they know their history about male and female cartoonists. People I respect and know that.
How would you respond to that faction of fans who are so threatened by
Yes.
women working in the industry that they would be so vocal about it on social media?
Yes. Well, there's men like that, unfortunately, in the world. I mean, here in the United States, there are these men who really, they're so anti-feminist and so anti-women, the incels, the ones who are involuntarily celibate. Well, they're such horrible people that of course women won't sleep with them. It never occurs to them that maybe they should change and become the kind of guy that women like. There are always going to be people like that. There's always going to be people who hate. I think personally, when they attack specific women, which has been done, I think that those women should be flattered that they're so good and what they're doing is so good that those men hate them.
Speaking of that, which specific female comic artists do you currently follow, and would you recommend to viewers of this episode? Feel free to name as many as you want.
Sure, yeah. My mind suddenly has drawn a blank. I'm thinking of the woman the artist on Saga, who is so good. Suddenly the names
Fiona Staples.
Oh my God, she's so good.
She's incredible.
And the woman who, yes. And the woman who draws Monstrous, if you've seen that.
Sana Takeda.
Yes. Oh my God. I mean, there are so many women. Jillian
Tamaki.
Yes, thank you so much. You're helping me with the names. There are really so many women who are so great. And of course, Alison Bechtel, who's brilliant, know. And Kate Beaton, who I mentioned before, who is just so funny. She has literary humor. I love her humor and her comics because you have to be smart and you have to be well-read to get them. I mean, she does those comics about Shelley and Byron,
Yeah.
So there are many. I know I'm leaving tons out.
Yeah, that's a question I tend to ask people is which ones would you like to signal boost?
Emil Ferris, who did My Favorite Thing Is Monsters. I love her. She's incredible.
I heard about that. I haven't seen it myself, but
I recommend it.
I'll put it on the list. Is there anything you're currently working on that you'd like to plug?
Well, I do have 2 books coming out that were done way before the lockdown and the pandemic. During the pandemic, I did contribute, since the lockdown, short comics to 3 different anthologies that will be coming out. But my 2 books, wait, I think I have at least one that I can hold up and show you.
Cool.
This one, The Flapper Queens, is coming out in August. So very, very soon. And it's it's a history. It's about the women in the 20s and early 30s who did flapper cartoons. Because the flapper image here, that's by Nell Brinkley. The flapper was the new woman, really. And after the war, after World War I, things changed drastically. And, 2 years after the end of the war, women got the vote. And already they were, if you look at a woman from 1915 and look at a woman 10 years later, 1925, it's a completely different woman. She's not corseted anymore. Her skirts have gone up to her knees. She's chopped off her hair. She's smoking and drinking with the boys. She's voting. And at that point, it's kind of a little ironic because the women really thought they had true equality. Just once they got the vote, it was like, okay, we're here. But of course they weren't here. I mean, we still haven't had a woman president, not even a woman vice president. I hope we get one this time.
We're close.
And yes.
If your electoral system wasn't so archaic, you would have had one.
Yes, that's right, because Hillary won the popular vote. They had not really gotten true equality, but they thought they did. And compared to what they had before, it was equality. And so she was the new woman, and she was different. She worked. She was sharp, and she spoke up, and but that's who the flappers were. And there were a lot of women drawing cartoons about the flappers, and that's what's in this book.
It's excellent.
Gorgeous stuff, by the way, gorgeous.
Yeah, it looks great. Like I found out about Nell Brinkley from you, and that's because
exactly
she's incredible. She's an incredible artist.
Oh God, I know. There's such fans now, and of course the Brinkley book is way out of print. So, good luck if you can find it on Amazon at some kind of price that is not the cost of your arm and leg.
That's usually already the cost of shipping for the Philippines.
Oh my God, I know.
I've got a few more questions, and only a couple of them have to do with comics. So the first one is, what advice would you give to female aspiring cartoonists and to male fans and people and males in the industry? Like, how can we help?
This is going to really sound snotty, but we don't need your help. There are so many women now, and the real publishing companies, you don't have to just do guys punching each other anymore, because real publishing companies know how successful graphic novels are, and schools know that. I mean, when I went to school, if the teacher caught you with a comic, she would confiscate the comic. But nowadays, teachers give kids comics to read, supply comics, and I've written a lot of educational comics for classrooms, because they know the kids that maybe don't want to read will read comics, and that's the doorway to books, the entrance to books. So it's great. It's great. The atmosphere could not be better for women creating comics these days. And I think that those trolls, I think that they don't matter at all. There's something to laugh at. As for men, we may not need your help, but we like your companionship, and we like to be your equal in creating comics. And there are so many women-friendly men and so many guys who also really don't want to do superheroes. It isn't just men, women, it's men who want to tell real stories, and men who do not want to draw women as giant breasts and butts. And these guys are great. I don't just read women's graphic novels. There's some wonderful graphic novels out there by men.
Yeah, I realized, I told you before this interview, the first 3 of my first 4 interviews were males who wrote female protagonists.
Who were they, out of curiosity?
The first one is a Filipino writer named Budget Tan. who has a comic out called Trece, which is about a paranormal investigator in the streets of Manila. And she basically what he said was in his mind, when he created the character, it was a guy, and then he realized it would be better if the character was a woman. And then he wrote that in 2005. It's getting an international release in a couple of months.
Good.
And then the second one that I interviewed was Gene Ha.
Oh God, I love his stuff. Yes, sure.
He's great, and he's writing May, which is all women. And I thought that was, and then the third one I interviewed was Greg Rucka.
Yes, another really great guy. Yeah, that's what I mean when I say there are also, it isn't just women. There's guys out there who want to do really good comics and that doesn't involve people punching each other. And
I said 3 out of the 4 because the second one I actually interviewed was Dana Simpson, who does Phoebe and Her Unicorn.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a daily strip. It's always on Go Comics.
That's one that I'm not familiar with.
It's about a young girl who has a best friend who's a unicorn.
Which we all wish we could have.
Yeah, it's been described as Calvin and Hobbes, but it's been described as the feminist answer to Calvin and Hobbes. So those are my first 4 interviews. I've got a few more questions, and I hope you don't mind, but they have nothing to do with comics. But
no, that's fine.
Really curious. I'm wearing a Jimi Hendrix shirt. Yeah. So
yes.
I'm wearing a Jimi Hendrix shirt. I'm a big fan of classic rock. I was born in '82, but that's just what I gravitate towards. You knew Jim Morrison.
Why, yes.
And as the first person I've ever spoken to who personally knew Jim Morrison, I just have to ask, what was he like?
Extremely intelligent, but also very, very neurotic. Extremely intelligent, very neurotic, and incredibly good looking. How's that?
Would you say the movie in the 90s was accurate to his portrayal?
Accurate the way movies are, if you know what I mean, which is, there's always a Hollywood spin to it.
Which is exaggerated, probably. Yeah. And my last question is, how does it feel knowing that you were immortalized in a Joni Mitchell song, Ladies in the Canyon?
And it's such a lovely song. And Joni Mitchell is just, she's so incredible, that voice, that exquisite voice, and the brilliance of her lyrics. And it also, helps that she's so beautiful. Well, it was an honor. It was an honor.
Did you, in fact, wear wampum beads while filling your drawing book with lines?
Well, she used a lot of poetic license. I never wore wampum beads. Wampum is a kind of a shell. The Native Americans used it as shell money. It was love beads. We all wore love beads in the 60s. And someone had made this, gave it to me as I was just coming down from an acid trip. This woman gave me these beads, and I wore them all the time until they finally broke.
Amazing. As you look back on your career, I know you said that while you were in the middle of it, you didn't realize how many barriers you were breaking. But as you look back on your career now, and it must have been obvious to you now how many barriers you did break.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice.
How do you feel knowing that you are such an impactful figure in this industry that we all love?
When I finally kick the bucket, which isn't going to be for at least 20 more years, I want an obit in the New York Times. That's how I feel.
I'm very, very happy you graced us with your presence today.
You're so nice. It's really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Robbins.